The United Kingdom has just endured what many are calling its greatest diplomatic humiliation since the end of the British Empire. News struck London like a bombshell. India, the former colony, shut its doors on a British delegation led by Keir Starmer's closest allies, the man who vowed to restore British morale, and instead left the nation on its knees before the world. The episode was branded by the international press as a political earthquake. As New Delhi celebrated, Westminster sank into silence. Visas cancelled, meetings scrapped, total humiliation. For the first time in decades, it was Britain that heard a no, and not from just any nation, but from the very country that, for centuries, took orders from London. The irony is both cruel and symbolic. The empire that once ruled the waves can no longer navigate its own foreign relations. The nation that once lectured the world on morality has been taught a lesson in dignity, and all under the leadership of the man who turned British pride into an international joke. Keir Starmer. Images of the moment spread across the globe. The air of arrogance among Labour ministers gave way to sheer desperation. Phones ringing frantically, emergency meetings, vague statements, lost stares. Starmer, a man who lives by scripted speeches and rehearsed lines, was left speechless. Inside the Foreign Office, the mood was one of panic and denial, but on the streets, the people had already understood. Britain had been humiliated by a weak, ideological government out of touch with reality. Starmer's words about authoritarianism in India, meant to sound virtuous, were heard around the world as just another display of old imperial arrogance. Only this time, the world wasn't having it. New Delhi responded with firmness, pride, and memory. An Indian minister summed it up with a line that crossed oceans. "We will no longer be lectured by our former masters." That sentence landed like a slap in the face of an entire nation. A deserved slap. Because while the Labour government plays at morality, the UK drowns in inflation, insecurity, and global disrespect. The nation that once inspired fear now inspires pity. 2 days after Starmer's provocation, the pound plummeted against the Indian rupee, hitting its lowest value in months. The market reacted as it does to disaster, with panic. Analysts spoke of lost confidence, fleeing investors, and billions at risk in bilateral trade. But for the British people, the impact ran deeper. It wasn't just money at stake, it was national pride, the memory of an empire that no longer commands respect. As Delhi newspapers splashed headlines about independence and respect, London tabloids tried to downplay the fiasco with vague talk of diplomatic misunderstandings. No one bought it. The truth was that Starmer's government had achieved the unthinkable, turning the UK, once synonymous with power, into a nation seen as kneeling and voiceless. In the corridors of Parliament, the atmosphere was one of shame. Even Labour ministers whispered what no one dared say aloud: "We're being treated like a small country." As the pound melted and British credibility evaporated, Starmer's moralizing speeches seemed ever more detached from reality. He tried to pose as a defender of democracy, but came across as an echo of the colonial past, a pompous teacher lecturing a pupil who has long surpassed the master. And India's response was historic, not in the form of war, but of dignity. The whole world watched as the former colony gave the old empire a lesson in sovereignty. In the parliaments of Asia and Africa, applause rang out. The empire that once ruled now begged to be heard. Meanwhile, inside Westminster, faces were frozen in shock. Arrogance had turned to dread. Starmer realized too late that the world no longer obeys the British voice, and that preaching virtue while your own country collapses is the height of hypocrisy. Every word he uttered sounded hollow. every speech like a farce, and the people, tired of being shamed, began to wake up to the reality that this government had pushed the UK to the brink of irrelevance. Inside Buckingham Palace, King Charles's silence spoke louder than any statement. No official communique, no public word, just a cold, distant, almost resigned look. Sources close to the palace say the monarch was deeply ashamed by the amateurish handling of the Labour government and discreetly reached out to New Delhi in an attempt to contain the damage. No threats, no arrogance, just the instinct of a leader who understands the value of prudence, something Starmer never grasped. While the Prime Minister played at being an international moralist, the King watched the prestige of the crown slip away. The UK, which once set the world's rules, now begged not to be ignored. And perhaps that was the most painful blow, realizing that, under left-wing leadership, the nation that was once feared had become an object of pity. On the streets, the mood was one of shame and contained fury. Pubs were packed, veterans silent, citizens outraged. Many said they no longer recognized the country they were born in. If they can't even defend our honor, what will they defend next? Asked a former soldier in Manchester, tears in his eyes. On social media, the hashtags "Sure Britain humiliated" and "Or Starmer failed" dominated the debate. For ordinary citizens, the humiliation in New Delhi wasn't just diplomatic, it was personal. It was as if the defeat had crossed the ocean and struck at the soul of the British people. National pride had been swapped for embarrassment, resolve for cowardice, and tradition for empty rhetoric. Even the BBC, always careful to protect the government, had to admit the obvious. The UK has lost influence. But between the lines, the message was far graver. The UK has lost respect. And when a nation ceases to be respected, all that remains is political theatre. The same theatre Starmer performs every day in Westminster. With the diplomatic collapse came internal collapse. The British economy, already weakened by inflation and reliance on external deals, plunged into total turmoil. Markets crashed, the pound kept falling, and foreign investors began pulling billions out of the country. It was as if the whole world had lost faith in the UK government's ability to stand on its own. Financial chaos compounded the moral crisis, and the result was devastating. Zero confidence. Even European allies watched the scene with irony. France and Germany stayed silent, preferring to observe Britain's decline from the front row. And once again, Starmer appeared on television with the same robotic speech, talking about global cooperation as the country crumbled. The public reacted with anger. Social media exploded with memes depicting the Prime Minister as a puppet of globalism, unable to protect British interests. What was meant to be a diplomatic stumble had become an existential crisis. The UK was no longer the UK. It was a shadow of what it once was. Before we go on, a quick message. If you, too, feel ashamed to see our country humiliated by incompetence, then show that there are still those who truly love the United Kingdom. Leave a like right now and subscribe to the channel, because here the truth is not silenced, and every new subscriber helps show that the British people still have a voice, courage, and memory. Let's expose together what the media tries to hide. Inside Parliament, the tension was almost palpable. Conservative MPs pounded their desks demanding answers, while Labour MPs muttered rehearsed lines about dialogue and mutual understanding. But no one believed in dialogue anymore. The people wanted leadership, not excuses. Even neutral figures began to question whether Starmer was fit to remain in office. Rumors of resignation started circulating in the corridors of Westminster, and journalists described the atmosphere as a political wake. What was once a government now looked like an institution in decay. propped up only by the arrogance of a leader who refuses to admit failure. Speeches that once rang with passion now echoed in an empty parliament, devoid of emotion and faith. It was the perfect portrait of a nation that had lost its voice. The UK, which once commanded respect with a word, could no longer even be heard. And perhaps that was the cruelest punishment. No longer being feared, not even taken seriously. As chaos gripped Westminster, the press tried to shield Starmer, but even they couldn't hide the truth. The country was falling apart. Papers like The Guardian and The Independent tried to paint the India incident as a diplomatic misunderstanding. But the people had seen the video, read the foreign headlines, and felt the impact in their wallets. The narrative no longer held. In the squares and online, anger grew. Talk shows began featuring veterans and outraged citizens asking what every Briton wanted to know. How long will we be led by a man who doesn't respect his own country? Meanwhile, Buckingham Palace maintained absolute silence, and to many, that silence sounded like royal disapproval. Inside the royal residence, advisors close to the king commented that His Majesty saw the crisis as a reflection of the loss of national morale and identity. The left, however, pretended all was normal, repeating the same empty phrases as the labor base crumbled under the weight of shame. And it was in this leadership vacuum that the people began to turn to forgotten figures, veterans, conservatives, and independent voices who still dared to say what many were thinking. Alternative programs, podcasts, and patriotic influencers began to grow in popularity, showing that the real UK, the UK of the people, was not dead, just silenced. While Starmer and his ministers locked themselves in meetings, the streets pulsed with indignation. From pubs in Liverpool to Birmingham, the feeling was the same. They've lost the world's respect, and now they want us to pretend everything's fine. People no longer believed in Labour's promises of renewal. What they saw was a fractured country, governed by a leader who prefers to please globalists rather than protect his own citizens. And among the older generation, the patriotic heart of the UK, that perception turned into pure fury. Because it was no longer about politics, but about the moral survival of an entire nation. As the world moved on, the UK seemed frozen in time, trapped in speeches and protocols that no longer meant anything. The powers of the East, India, Japan, Brazil, and the Gulf states, announced a new digital alliance that simply ignored London. No invitation, no consultation. The message was clear. The British era was over. The Starmer government tried to respond with cold notes and statements about international cooperation, but the world had already made up its mind. The UK was no longer a leader. It was just a spectator. Washington, once a loyal ally, called the episode a natural rearrangement of power. That phrase sounded like an epitaph for an empire that was once feared, but now only remembered. And Starmer? He kept smiling for the cameras, pretending to be in control, while every statement he made served as another reminder that respect is not regained with speeches. It is earned with strength. And strength is something his government never had. And tell me one thing, from which part of the UK or the world are you watching this video? I want to see in the comments how far the voice of the British who do not surrender reaches. Write down if you're from London, Manchester, Scotland, or even if you're abroad, because it's the united people who make the difference. And this community is growing every day. But perhaps the most terrifying thing is what's happening within Britain's borders. The public no longer believes anything that comes out of Westminster. People no longer discuss politics. They discuss survival. Pubs have become confessionals for a nation in ruins. In schools, teachers now treat the British Empire as a distant legend, and the young laugh at what was once a source of pride. Meanwhile, in care homes, war veterans turn off the television to avoid seeing the country they defended being ridiculed by a cowardly government. The UK is losing not just power, but its sense of self. The generation that built the country watches, powerless, as everything they valued, honor, duty, patriotism, is destroyed. And at the center of it all is Starmer, a man without soul, without backbone, without courage, who managed to turn the most respected nation on the planet into a stage for international jokes. And it is at this point that even the most skeptical begin to realize what is at stake is not just politics. It is the soul of the United Kingdom. The country that once faced wars, crises, and enemy empires now crumbles from within, victim of leaders who are ashamed to love their own nation. Under Starmer, traditions have become offenses, patriotism has become extremism, and those who dare to defend the British legacy are treated as relics. But the people have not forgotten. In the squares, in the forgotten communities of the North, in the ports and the fields, a new sentiment is growing, one of silent revolt. People no longer trust the newspapers, the parties, or the promises. They trust only one idea, that the UK must rise from the ashes. What happened with India was more than a diplomatic warning. It was a mirror held up to Westminster's decay. And when a nation looks at its own reflection and no longer recognizes itself, it is time for change. And perhaps that change has already begun. Because while the government tries to suppress the scandal and the media pretends at normalcy, millions of Britons are waking up. They are rediscovering the pride of who they are, questioning the globalist farce that has taken power, and demanding respect, not just abroad, but at home. The UK does not need more excuses. It needs courage. It needs leaders who do not apologize for existing, but who raise the flag and say, without fear, "We are Great Britain, and we will not be erased." Starmer's failure will not be forgotten, because it exposed what many feared to admit. The left has destroyed the nation's moral heart. But as with all British history, there is always a chapter of redemption. And that chapter begins now, with the people, not the politicians. If you also believe that the UK must reclaim its voice, its honor, and its strength, subscribe to the channel and share this message. Because here, we do not stay silent in the face of truth. We shout it.